Ethnic media. You've probably heard the term, but do you know what it is and why it exists? We'll take a look at some of the issues affecting ethnic media on Talking with Henrietta, coming up next. Hi, I'm Henrietta. Welcome to the show. Did you know there are approximately 2,500 ethnic media organizations in the U.S.? These media outlets reflect African, African American, Asian, European, Native American, Latino, and Middle Eastern communities. The latest available statistics show that nearly 60 million Americans of African American, Latino, and Asian backgrounds get their news and information from ethnically oriented media outlets. On this show, my guests and I will discuss the role of ethnic media, how ethnic media differs from mainstream media, and the future of both forms of media. And now to my guest. Seated on my left is Diana Ding. Ms. Ding is a Silicon Valley media entrepreneur who is the founder and CEO of Ding Ding TV, which is the U.S.'s first Chinese-American internet TV outlet. She is the co-founder and CEO of Silicon Valley Entrepreneur Festival, and she is an award-winning and innovative program director and a radio and television personality. I can't think of anyone more equipped to talk about ethnic media than Sandy Close. Ms. Close is the co-founder of New America Media, which was once described as the largest, oldest, and most diverse network of ethnic media outlets in the United States. New America Media closed 2 years ago this month and was succeeded by another media outlet, Ethnic Media, which Ms. Close also founded. Vandana Kumar is seated to my far right. Ms. Kumar is a media executive with 32 years' experience. In 1987, she became a founding member of India Currents magazine. Today, the magazine is fully digital and reaches 200,000 readers every month. Well, thank you so much for being here. I am truly honored to have you to talk with.
Thank you.
And whatever questions we have about ethnic media, you'll give insight. So let me start with you, Diana. You know, we say ethnic media, and for some it might seem obvious, but for others it might not be. So what's ethnic media to you?
Ethnic media to me, you know, I feel that I found God's calling for my life. And I found where I belong to, and really something I'm really passionate about it. I feel it's very important telling our story in our own way in this country, because as the first generation media entrepreneur, I see the sufferers, I see the loneliness of all the immigrants. Talking about Chinese American, not everybody is so successful, especially for entrepreneurs. I see the struggles. So we really want to tell their story and tell other people's story, inspire myself and inspire others.
So for you, ethnic media is telling the stories of a community, a specific community.
Yes. When we first started, we don't have enough money and resources, so we decided instead of following the hot news, because we don't have, you know, this money to do so, so we decided to create a positive impact through dialogue. So we had an innovation dialogue. We have interviewed over 1,000 people telling their stories through this.
That's amazing. Vandana.
I think sounds something very similar to what I would say, which is the Silicon Valley has a rather skewed version of what an Indian immigrant is like. You know, not everybody fits the mold of the successful Silicon Valley entrepreneur. Yes, they're certainly there, but our community, the Indian American community, is much more than that. And the reason India Current started was because at a time, now you have to remember, my magazine is 32 years old, and it started at a time when the internet was not even around.
1987.
1987.
Yes.
And the only way to connect, I also relate to what Diana said, you know, there is an incredible sense of loneliness that I felt as a first-generation immigrant. You know, I was an immigrant in a foreign land where I knew nobody at all in this big, wide country. And so you start looking for, surely there are other people that are having the same experience as I am. Surely there are others who are feeling this tremendous loneliness. Surely there are others that are experiencing this new country in the way that I am. And then if I found my other people, then I wouldn't feel like I'm alone.
So therefore you started a magazine, India Currents?
That's why the magazine started, to search for others that were like experiencing life in a new country just like I was.
Well, Sandy, I saved you for last. First of all, Diana and Vandana talked about being immigrants, and so immigrants in a big country that was a foreign country. That is not your case, but I don't think. But how did you get involved?
Well, first of all, I have to say what's inspiring about working in ethnic media is that I get to work with people like you guys, who one of the striking things about bringing ethnic media colleagues to a briefing or a training or some sort of civic event is that there's very little cynicism. And I was a journalist for maybe 25 years, running a news service, a nonprofit news service that mainly provided content for what we called in mainstream news
was
organizations. That in Berkeley? No, San Francisco. It's called Pacific News Service. And I felt somehow that there was a parallel universe of news that we were missing. And I had the great advantage of a husband who spoke 12 languages and read 12 languages, one of which was Chinese. He was a China scholar.
Oh, wow.
And he would read what was in the World Journal and the Tsingtao, and he would tell me, you know, here's this editorial. And I remember there was an initiative on the ballot to restrict the courts from sentencing children under the age of 18 to prison. And this editorial, which was in the World Journal by, it turned out later, a man named Yu Chen, quoted Confucius about why people should vote in favor of this proposition. Because Confucius taught that to raise children, you had to teach them remorse. And if you put a kid in prison too young, they wouldn't have time to learn remorse. Now, in that period, it was the mid-1990s, people thought of Chinese media as very conservative, and they were really surprised that here was this, I was surprised that here was this editorial backing an early version of criminal justice reform. But the thing that really struck me was how parochial I was not to know that one of the leading sources of news in the city I lived in, for the largest ethnic immigrant group, Chinese, had this position on a major political issue.
Well, you could have told yourself you can't know everything about everything, right?
But if you're in the business of journalism, and mainstream journalism, to give it its due, had this vision of reflecting who we are becoming. You would pick up the newspaper and feel you are connecting to the city you live in, and it was giving you a mirror of that city and a sense of who that city was becoming. If you're in mainstream journalism, I said to myself, and you don't know what's in this parallel universe of news, what kind of job are you doing? So we invited journalists from ethnic media to a Chinese lunch around several round tables, and it was like this spark that just popped up out of the conversation. We all realized if you added up the circulations of all the 24 news outlets, this was 1996, we were bigger, as one of the editors said, than the two mainstream media combined. So there was a tremendous excitement about how we could share information with each other, and by working together, we could become more visible. I have to say, I was a greedy editor in search of content I didn't know, because my language skills were nothing like my husband's, and I thought if all of us got together and told each other stories, think of how much richer mainstream media would be.
What was the format in
Well,
terms of?
one of the first things we did, and India Currents was a very early member, as were Chinese language media and black media, Hispanic media, Filipino media. One of the first things we did was a television show, just like this. And it was moderated by Emil Guillermo, and it was essentially news of the day if you were able to access multiple in-language and English language media outlets. And we also started, right at that first lunch, the idea of calling it New California Media. So this was not any brilliant idea on my side. It was a collective understanding that to do justice to the news of and the intimate lives of a state as diverse as California, there was no way you could do it without bringing the richness and the personal stories and the perspectives, as in the case of Confucius, of ethnic media to the table.
So, do you all see the fact that there are these different ethnic media outlets a fault in terms of mainstream media? Could mainstream media be expected to be representative of all communities within a particular city?
But it should be, right?
Well, I'm thinking.
And because it was not, and I'm going to tell about my experience, which is when I, in 1987, if you looked, I got the Mercury News. That was, I lived in San Jose. If I scanned the papers, I found nothing that reflected any, I didn't see myself in any of these stories.
And what was the Indian population at that time?
I'm not sure. It was pretty small. Yeah, it was pretty small at that point. I don't know, maybe 50,000 in the Bay Area, maybe less. I'm not exactly sure what the numbers were at that
But still,
time.
that's a lot.
Yes, but we were all scattered, and there was no way to actually come together. And what India Currents actually did is created a platform where people gathered. And a lot of times, people, when I meet now, they say that you're actually responsible for creating a community. Till that time, we were separate individuals.
So
we were not really one community.
We have the website for India Currents, and maybe we can pull it up while you're talking. If you could say, here we go. So tell us about it in terms of, I noticed when I looked there were stories from India.
The most recent picture story up there is the fact that India Currents won 8 awards at the San Francisco Press through at the San Francisco Press Club Award nights last week.
Yes.
So these are stories about Indian Americans. Our stories are not about India. Our stories are about Indians living in the United States. And immigrants living here have the same concerns as all other immigrants. We just view them through a specific cultural lens. If we are talking about elections, or we are talking about resources that are available to our community, all of these things are just as relevant to an Indian immigrant versus anybody else.
So I see 4 photos on the second, right underneath the first row.
Yeah.
So what are those 4 stories?
These are our events. Our events calendar was actually was our most, and still remains one of our most important and popular features. This is all our content is crowdsourced. Now, we have a term for it today, right? Crowdsource. But we were crowdsourcing stories since 1987, when we actually didn't have a term to describe it. So India Currents has been a community magazine, and our format has been always different from every other media outlet that existed. We didn't have writers in-house that went out and covered stories. We had community members that contributed stories. All we did in-house was editing.
And you circulated it right now. I think I said at the top, it reaches digitally 200,000 readers every month. So and that's not how you started, though.
But no. We started as a print magazine, very local, here in the Valley. And as we grew, we realized that there was a real hunger from community members for the kind of content that we were creating. First of all, the events calendar that you asked me about. We started collating a calendar of events, things that would interest Indian immigrants, things that might have, this could be music, it could be food, it could be a radio show, it could be a television show that in some ways connected with India.
Sure, we can drop the website now. Yeah. And I'll get back to you to talk more about India Currents.
I would just add one thing.
Sure.
As somebody who was really inspired not only by Chinese but also by India Currents, it was a highly literary journal, and this made, I think, the intimate life of Indian Americans in Silicon Valley so it was so revealing because it wasn't straight news. It was, I would say, literary journalism. And I think anyone who wants to look at the history of Silicon Valley, and I've looked at many books that have purported to be histories of Silicon Valley, that ignore what you could access about Silicon Valley's true inner life had you accessed India Currents. In other words, they're missing a whole dimension.
But at the same time, there's something called the niche market, right? Where you have a specific target audience.
Yes.
And mainstream media, those newspapers have a very general audience, right? So would they be expected to talk about the Indian American community or the Chinese American community, Diana?
Yeah, I don't see, when we used to have the Mercury News and those, I really don't see the stories really cover Chinese American, very few.
Even now?
Yeah, even now, well, for now, I seldom read newspaper. I actually read online all the time on my cell phone. So there are some, but you will see there's some misunderstanding, I would say, is because many of the news are negative news. They're talking about Huawei, they're talking about trade war. You will see all the negative news. But I would say, from my perspective, to see all these things, I would say this totally wrong, but they don't really have the real, the true things about the story, but from both sides. That's how I feel.
I just to pick up on this, African American media, black media was really at the forefront, along with Native and Hispanic. But in 1827, Freedom Journal, the first black newspaper in New York, had a mission statement that I think goes to the heart of your question about ethnic media's role. It was, "We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us." And it's that sense of a collective voice, an advocacy voice for a community otherwise in the shadows, are misreported, ignored, and stigmatized, that the advocacy role ethnic media play has been, I think, such a critical reason for why it exists. It continues to command respect and trust, and truly the Wen Ho Lee case,
Oh, yes.
the case of the China spy.
Yes.
In 1995, there appears in the New York Times a front page story on the China spy. What is the evidence that this person is the China spy? It was Chinese language media, regardless of whether it came from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, the whole diaspora media, despite the political differences, came together in defense of Wen Ho Lee, this alleged China spy. And it wasn't the Mercury, it wasn't the Chronicle, it was the Tsingtao, the World Journal, the China Press, all of the Chinese media, KTSF, that said he's been denied due process, this is unjust. And I think it was the powerful example
It's happened again.
of the advocacy voice mainstream media would not have been able to play.
Yes.
They could not get inside the community and tell that story of despair and horror that a man was being condemned without evidence, without due
spy.
process, as the China spy. And of course he was exonerated, but it took a long time.
Exactly, it's such an inspiring story, because I know some of the successful entrepreneurs, Chinese American entrepreneurs. They were the one to support Wen Ho Lee at that time, and also they were the one to support some organizations like Civic Leadership Forum, like Vision New American. After that happened, those organizations, and they so many people got involved. They paid a tremendous attention to civic engagement.
It was a mobilizing event.
Yeah, exactly.
But in the same way, Henrietta, the Million Man March would not have happened without black media. And there were a million. I was on that march, and it was condemned, ignored, including by the feminist press, which played a terribly, I think, really just sort of completely misunderstanding. At the height of a decade of gratuitous violence, the African American community decides they need to make a show of force and pull back from essentially black on black crime that was really at epic proportions. Why that got condemned routinely by mainstream and even left-wing media with no understanding showed the chasm, I think, between understanding truly the perceptions and aspirations of communities that don't have their own voice, that need media to give voice to their own concerns.
That's a very important point to take away from this. We tell our stories in our own voices. We don't have others to speak.
So let me just say this, what you're saying is the very reason that I founded the East Palo Alto Today newspaper, and our logo is giving the people a voice, so that the news about the community is reflecting exactly what's happening within the community, and the issues, the critical, relevant issues, and what people themselves are saying about it. And it's not the sensational news that the mainstream media presents, let's say, of the East Palo Alto community. because you've talked about that.
Yeah.
And that's what's out there, the crime and all of the negative aspects. And there is so much that's good going on in communities like the ones we're talking about. And so having an ethnic media outlet also gives other communities an opportunity to see what's happening in specific ethnic communities.
And I want to say to, you know, I'm glad that Sandy is here because I get to say this to her in person. I think she's been a role model for many of us. The idea that we could all come together, and it's through Sandy that I've gotten to know you, Henrietta, and I met Diana elsewhere, but through NAM and the events New America Media, I got to know so many other ethnic media outlets. And I realized that all of us had the same struggles, you know? We were all trying to tell the same kind of stories, meaning stories that were not covered by the mainstream press. Because just like she said, as far as I was concerned, it was news of the weird, about India that would get covered in the mainstream press. The longest mustache, or
the cobra, the person,
or the cobra, or, you know. I remember when I had first come, somebody asked me, do you take a flute to work? I was like, why would I take a flute? It's like to charm the snakes. It's like, good Lord, you know? I've never seen a snake.
Did you have snakes at work?
No.
Yeah, I was asked that.
I have never seen a snake.
I was asked, do you know Kung Fu? Or something like that.
So there is danger if there is only one narrative that's out there.
Yeah,
now,
that's right.
you mentioned how Sandy has brought us all together, and we have a photo from the meeting in Sacramento that we can talk about if we can pull that up. And while they're pulling it up, there we are. So Sandy, tell us about that.
Well, that was part of an effort over much of 2018 to educate legislators about the importance of ethnic media as a bridge, a communication bridge to diverse audiences that they needed to invest in for the 2020 census to be successful. We realized that community-based organizations had done a great job of influencing legislators, educating, inspiring legislators to commit funding for their role in outreaching to their communities around the census. But you can't do it alone. You need also the media that are trusted in those communities.
So can you identify some of, we see Vandana right there, and sitting beside her.
You there.
Okay, I don't know how we managed to miss Diana on this one, but we see Han Lee from the World Journal, Francis Espiritu from Philippine News, Amar Gupta from Siliconeer, Henrietta, and Vandana. Now that was just one table. We had several tables. But I think going up there, and honestly, after all these years of organizing ethnic media events to build the visibility, somehow it hadn't dawned on me. We have to go to the legislators' offices and educate them, because in many ways it's kind of an abstraction. They don't really know, oh, it's so big, there's so many, and it's so diverse. And so it was a little late in the day for me to come to this awareness, but the 2020 census was the perfect rationale for getting in the door and saying, we're all prepared to do whatever possible to ensure an accurate count. You have to invest in us in order for us to be able to ensure that we can invest in the census.
We have,
Tell me, I'll join you next time. Yes, really.
Oh,
yes.
good.
It's important,
we have
yes,
another
so
photo too of everyone. I missed it somehow. I stopped
there
to
it is.
ask a question.
That was where that was I think that was one of 3 days. And what's exciting is when you combine the biggest of the media, like Univision and some of the large dailies, like the Tsingtao and the World Journal, with the smaller publications and online television stations, you get this extraordinary mix of media serving multiple audiences coming together. And I think that's what the legislators were really impressed by. It was all of us together. Chauncey Bailey, who was killed, and I think most people don't realize it's great to be able to be the voice of your community, but it's also scary.
Yes.
Because you break taboos, and there is a kind of sensorial attitude, and all 5 journalists who've been killed in the line of duty since 1975
And who are
have
you
been
thinking about?
ethnic media journalists. And Chauncey was
Bailey,
the last.
the Oakland Tribune.
No, the Oakland Post, and Chauncey
That's right.
was reporting
On the Muslim
in
bakery.
2007 on extortion practices by a local black enterprise that people were afraid of, but they were also afraid of breaking the news about. And it turned out ultimately he was assassinated by somebody from that group of people. But I'm simply saying, whether it was Vietnamese, whether it was Chinese, whether it was Hispanic or African American, there's great strength in representing the collective voice of community. But if you go up against the collective perspective as defined by certain forces within that
the
community,
power group perhaps within that community.
You might as well be confronting, holding the powerful accountable, holding the community accountable can be very, very dangerous.
Yes, especially when you're within a small community.
And so we should really work together.
So
Yes,
that brings up another question. Right now there is a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment within the country that was stirred up. And I'm wondering, have you run into resentment? To give you an example, I saw a video just recently of this young woman in Montana who was speaking Spanish and was stopped by the policeman because he said, "You're speaking Spanish." And she responded in English. It's like, but what's wrong with me talking Spanish?
Yeah.
So she happens to be suing the police department, but then at the same time, when this happened online, there was a lot of vitriol against her, as if somehow you're not allowed to speak Spanish. So I'm wondering, have you received any resentment or pushback?
Not me personally, but we did interview a Sherry Chen, and she is a scientist, national scientist, and she was accused as a spy by American, I think CIA. Yeah, so it's really a tragedy for her happened.
The whole idea of information being sort of somehow smuggled by Chinese scientists and technology experts back to China, which was really the story of Wen Ho Li, that is such a pervasive and powerful kind of perception. And I do fear outbreaks of that. In fact, I see more and more stories that sort of point to that.
So the spy story isn't one that we have seen in the Indian American community. However, you know about the man who was actually shot in a bar in Kansas City because somebody thought he's an Arab.
Yes.
One thing. The other thing is, to the stereotype that I mentioned, Indians are certainly facing a backlash because people think we've come and taken away jobs from the locals. people who've been living here for a long time. The Indian American community is a very recent immigrant to the United States. And in that sense, there's a large first generation immigrant population. And so we have tons of reports of people being, there are hate crimes. And we've also probably all heard about Sikhs,
Yes.
who are also,
I
first
was
of all,
going to
mistaken
mention them.
as
Yes.
Arabs. And a lot of people have been killed simply because some people think they belong to a certain race or ethnicity. And the reality is, for people from India, our skin color sets us apart. We can be here, and this is a conversation that I've had with my kids a very long time ago, when they told me, one of my sons told me that, Mom, you're Indian, I'm American. And I'm sure this is a conversation that happens in many immigrant families. And I had to tell him that, yes, you're American, but when both of us are standing, and the only thing people are going to judge you by
Is
your
look.
skin
How you
color
look.
and how you look.
Yes.
So I said, you need to be comfortable with who you are, because you can think yourself as only American, but the world will look at you and continue to ask you, where are you from?
So the question for me now is, we've talked about how ethnic media gives a voice for individual communities. How are you putting that voice out there, or is that voice being put out there to other people, to the mainstream communities, to further their understanding of what your individual communities and your individual publications and media outlets are all about?
I feel like through events is a good way to do so, because we organize a lot of events every year. We have a studio in Santa Clara, so it's like 4,000 square feet. So many events happen at our place. For this year, right now it's November, and we look back, and already more than 70 events
Talk
happening.
about them. What kind of events?
We organize the Civic Leadership Forum 4 times a year, inspire the next generations. Because, Vandana's been doing this with me together. We started this 2 years ago, and Vandana joined me from the end of last year.
Yeah.
We feel it's very important, because as a first generation immigrants, you come here, you work really hard. You know where you're from and why you're here, and why you have to work really hard. But for the younger generation, they don't really have the same sense. But they can enjoy their life. But we always think it's important for them to remember where their parents come from and why we're here in this country and what we stand for.
So do you feel that in terms of the sentiment of this country, where, let's say, first generation Europeans said it's not that they severed ties, but for example, some Hispanic communities didn't teach their children Spanish because they wanted them to speak English and take on American culture.
Well,
So some Americans might think, well, where's your allegiance?
Yeah.
That kind of divides your allegiance.
I don't think it's a question of allegiance. I think all the immigrants that came, certainly, again, I'm speaking for the Indian American community, people came here for better opportunities. I know that that's what got me here. And we love America. This is our home. But the fact is, you mentioned a European. A first-generation immigrant from Europe can come here and be accepted as American. And people say, why can't you just become only American?
Yes, exactly.
I want to be only American, but people don't treat me like that. They're always asking, like, where are you from?
where are you from?
So I darn well know where I'm, where I am from. because I'm going to be asked that. My children are going to be asked that question. My great-grandchildren are going to be asked, until, you know, there is intermingling and then they become, you know, hard to tell where they're from. But till we look different, that's a question we've got to answer.
Well, you know, it's interesting. Other people seem to forget that their parents came from someplace too.
Everyone came from
I feel
somewhere
like,
else.
Yes, as
But
a media
the
is
events you're talking about, Diana, I think you're both absolutely right. There's so much sort of, there's such a broad assumption that we can do it all on social media. We can make it all happen because now we have the technology to be a village. The world can be on my cell phone, and we can understand and even see what the village you came from in China looks like. We can get it on our cell phone. There is no substitute for proximity, for what kids always call conversating, which I love because conversating means it truly is engaging people in exchange.
And it's a dialogue, right?
Our dialogue sort of means one-on-one, but it's really an exchange. It's more inclusive. And I also really think, as California is sort of at the forefront of this, with the diversity that exists, being able to bring people together, and especially when the media they trust is sort of the convener of those events, means that groups will get on better with each other.
Yes, exactly.
They may not like each other, but they will. It's better not to like than not to understand.
Yes.
It's better to understand. Aretha used to sing that way, Aretha Franklin. We may not like you, but damn, I wish I could sing like you. So it is really, I think, commendable. And years ago, I asked Monica Lozano, who was the publisher of La Opinion and the granddaughter of the founder of La Opinion, what is ethnic media? And she quoted her brother, actually, saying, ethnic media is convener of community. It is the convener of community. Very much what Vandana was saying and what you were saying, that you break out of your loneliness, but the danger of becoming a silo. And I think of Koreans as a good example. The language barrier for Koreans is so high. They have the lowest census enrollment of any ethnic group, and it's a language barrier, but it also becomes self-fulfilling.
There are many Korean people here.
When Korean media work with Asian Indian media, Black media, Native American media, etc., Chinese media, there's a possibility that maybe we're all anxious to make ourselves stronger by being, as Chauncey Bailey used to say, fingers on a hand. When we're together, we can become stronger.
You have a wonderful historical perspective. In terms of new American media, it was online. How did it start out? In terms of being a convener of all of these ethnic media.
It was the round table over lunch, breaking bread together, and somehow, I remember very well, it was both in San Francisco, and then we went to San Jose. India Currents hosted a dinner for us along with Ilbert Morales of El Observador, and the Chinese newspaper and the Asian Indian and the Hispanic and the African American, each saying to each other, and the Vietnamese, what's it like to be Vietnamese in an Hispanic neighborhood? Well, tell me and I'll run it. There was this sense that we want to discover each other, even as we'd also like to be more visible and accepted by mainstream media. You asked the question, Henrietta, of why is this mainstream media's fault? Look, ethnic media would not exist if mainstream media could have fulfilled that ambition of inclusion, of representing who we are becoming, whether deliberately, intentionally, or simply out of ignorance. Now it's lack of resources.
Yeah.
And I think it's made the role ethnic media play more indispensable than ever.
So talk about, yes, Diana, you're going to say.
I was going to say that we are so fortunate to have someone like Sandy, because she's from mainstream media, but she has a sense and she has a compassion, and she really have this passion for all the ethnic group to work together, and you see the needs and importance of this. We organize events like Silicon Valley Entrepreneurs Festival, and we want to create a platform for all the ethnic entrepreneurs to be able to come and share the resource and talk to investors and also launch their new product. Because it's the same, you know, we are ethnic media where we feel like we're not represented. Ethnic entrepreneurs, it's the same. Yeah, their struggle too. So we try to tell their stories. But you know, we feel that's very important. We have someone like Sandy, very important, because when we tell our story, maybe not exactly the way that mainstream would like to read or like to watch. So we really need someone like her, that it's like a bridge between this.
So we're talking, Sandy, you just now said the role of ethnic media is more important now than ever. However, all media, for the most part, are facing dwindling dollars. And so while that role is more important than ever, what's the future financially? How are the different ethnic medias to be continued?
Very difficult, I would say.
I want to make a bold pitch, because I've been thinking about this a lot. And the census is a perfect moment for exploring this. Community-based organizations, nonprofits, play a very important role. They're key to the infrastructure of many of our communities. They were very smart, and they did get investment from the state for communicating about the census. And they did it by saying they needed that support to expand their communication capacity. None of them thought to talk about ethnic media. There was a sense, I think, that ethnic media will always be there. They're always the people who show up, and it's their job. There is very little understanding that ethnic media, unlike nonprofits, are for profit. I think partly because most ethnic media never even imagined they could, by serving their communities through starting these media outlets, be nonprofit. Nobody ever heard of a 501c3, right? So they're for profit, but as they rely on advertising, nonprofits rely on grants. Now, I don't think that nonprofits can be as effective without ethnic media. Ethnic media won't be as effective without strong ties with nonprofits. They need each other. So I think we really need to look to the nonprofit sector now to be an advocacy voice for a return on investment that has been very slow to come for the historic role and now the more or less critical turning point ethnic media have reached.
When the East Palo Alto Today newspaper was launched, it was launched by the East Palo Alto Center for Community Media, which was the 501c3 nonprofit. And I find more and more mainstream newspapers now are going the way of nonprofits. Not only do you get those advertising dollars, you also get the grants or an opportunity to...
The dwindling ad revenues have struck across all media organizations, ethnic media, mainstream media. We are at a very interesting point in our history where we are seeing this transition, turbulence. I don't know where we are going to end up. We are still trying to figure out what's the model going to be. And India Currents was not a nonprofit organization, an ethnic media serving the community, but this was also became the need of the hour, where I realized that in order for us to survive and to be able to continue to do, ad revenue wasn't just going to be enough. We needed to look for other resources so that we could continue to tell our stories, because telling those stories was very important.
My husband said, you are doing something like a nonprofit organization, but you are not a nonprofit.
Have you considered becoming a
I
nonprofit?
consider, especially after today's dialogue, I really seriously consider about that. Because we didn't even know, we don't have.
No, will we all be out there competing for those grants?
No,
No. And you're obviously saying that there
grows
are
the field.
enough
There
grants
grows.
out there.
Here's a fascinating thing, and I take this as a criticism of the failure to sustain the visibility of the sector. Huge concern now over the disappearance of local news. Well, what is more local and global, very cosmopolitan, than ethnic media? And yet none of the coverage, the long articles in respected journals or mainstream newspapers about the fate of local news mentions ethnic media. It is not visible at all.
So would it be in the interest of mainstream media to mention ethnic media?
I think
if they're not covering ethnic communities, why then should mainstream media mention ethnic media?
In 2000, when the 2000 census was released a year or so later, and suddenly people realized, yes, this is a demographic shift of, I'm sorry for the cough, of epic proportions. And I think mainstream media really wanted to do a better job, really wanted to diversify, and then they got clobbered by the recession and the shift to digital advertising. I see mainstream media and ethnic media now essentially in the same boat. I think we're going to have to make a strong case, and rather than asking mainstream media, which is having a hard time of its own, we need to look to the community-based organizations that are getting support to do work that involves civic engagement and need us to amplify that, to tell the stories. Very often advocates don't know how to tell their own story. We do. They come off sounding like polemicists.
Now, a question for you. And before I ask that question, just to point out that there are less reporters from minority communities now working on the staff of mainstream media than there were maybe 20 years ago.
That's also a question of dwindling resources.
Yeah, and that's really is.
Now, you keep, from the time we started, Sandy, you have been emphasizing the idea of advocacy. And yet at the same time, the traditional role of a journalist was not to advocate, but to share both sides of the story, to take away their own individual opinion and just give the facts.
That goes to the fact that ethnic media have always played a distinctive role. They are their own genre of journalism. It is a sector. It is not lesser than, it is different from. And I think the importance of acknowledging that when you're the collective voice, that Freedom Journal statement, which Amelia Ward first quoted to me in 1996, and I never forgot it, we wish to plead our own cause, too long have others spoken for us. It's a collective pronoun, we. Most journalism is I, and it is a distinct form of journalism that has as a key part of it the the collective voice of the community and advocacy. And look at the newspapers called The Advocate, The Defender. Black journalism is full of those
Yes.
words.
Yes.
Advocacy, Diana?
Yeah, I feel like as a ethnic media, we didn't really tell our own stories. We tell other people's story, but we seldom tell our own story. But today we really
Very good
appreciate.
point.
Thank you so much for
Oh, of
telling our own
course.
stories. It's such
Very
an
good
honor
point.
to
Thank
be
you
here.
so much for being
so-
here to tell your stories.
People don't know how we survive because the situation changed. Nowadays, they thought, oh, you guys telling the story and you sell your advertising, but the fact is, we cannot sell advertising, especially online. There's no commercial.
There's no money.
No,
Yes.
no money, no money, no
Yes.
commercial at all. So people don't really understand the change for the situation
So
for the media.
the big advertiser, the 20th biggest advertiser in the country is the U.S. government at all levels. It really behooves the government to figure out how to communicate with the governed.
Yes, exactly.
When it is multiple languages, multiple backgrounds. And so I think rather than looking to or blaming mainstream journalism, which I think would like to be our allies, but it increasingly lacks the resources to deal with a language barrier, let alone the cultural barriers.
Well, that's a
But
very
the
positive
government-
statement.
I do
That you think the mainstream media would like to be our allies. They've never been historically. That's why there is ethnic media,
But,
because
you
that
know,
alliance was not there from the beginning.
One of the things that happens as you grow old is that you grow more impatient, but you also grow less critical. And I have found myself, it is hard to be a
Exactly.
journalist.
Exactly.
It's hard, and I love it when I see a good story. I don't care where it's in. And I know that it's easy. I just think we have a terrific role to play. Of that, I am convinced. The rationale for ethnic media has never been stronger. And as climate change triples the number of global migrants worldwide, the need for the kind of voice, the kind of convener of community role ethnic media traditionally have played is only going to get stronger. So
Sandy, I so
believe
much
in the future, but I think we have
so
to be
much
shrewd.
appreciate your perspective, and I'd like to thank you all. You've told your stories, and will
you.
continue to tell your stories.
Thank you.
So thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for being here, and I'd certainly like to thank our viewers for watching. Until next time.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Is it hours?